Hey everyone, it's the Unique History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from Communism History by Richard Pipes, and we'll be talking about Chile and Cuba. The Marxist regime of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1970-73 presents an unusual case of communist revolution attempted in a democratic country by democratic means. In the 1960s, the government of Chile was controlled by the Christian Democrats whose leader, Eduardo Frei, pursued fairly radical social and economic policies. In particular, Frei carried out an ambitious agrarian reform that called for expropriation with compensation of large estates. Frei also nationalized much of the mining industry. These measures had an effect of polarizing Chilean society between the right, which thought they were too far, and the left, which saw them as inadequate. The popularity of the Frei administration, was further undermined by inflation, which, on the eve of the 1970 presidential election, rose to 35%. In that election, the three leading candidates ran neck and neck. The largest votes, 36.3%, was cast for Salvador Allende, a medical doctor of Marxist sympathies, who represented the Popular Unity Party, a bloc of socialists and communists. The conservative runner-up received 34.9% of the vote. Because no candidate had won an absolute majority, the issue was referred to the Congress. During the 2 months that followed the election, Allende struck a deal with the Christian Democrats who agreed to support his candidacy, provided he subscribed to a set of conditions committing to honor Chile's constitution. These included respect for the law and political pluralism, spelled out in the Statute of Constitutional Guarantees passed by the Congress, to enable Allende to assume the presidency. Allende's Chilean road to socialism was thus, from the beginning, subject to restraints that implemented the radical designs of socialist and communist constitution. Despite his admiration for Fidel Castro, Allende was a romantic idealist rather than a fanatical revolutionary. But his doctrinaire backers, determined to introduce Chile to a dictatorship of the proletariat on the Soviet model, kept pushing him to the left, and his measures failed. He became radicalized. Allende believed that he could achieve socialist objectives by legal means on the assumption that his reforms would in time gain him the support of the nation's majority. The communists supported this strategy, convinced that Chile, their other objectives, could be attained peacefully. Unfortunately for them, this did not happen, in part because Allende's socialist legislation alienated much of the country, in part because it reduced the country's economy to shambles. After assuming the presidency, Allende entrusted the economic ministries in his United Popular Government to communists, who proceeded to nationalize the remaining mining industries, banking, and much of the manufacturing. Enacted by a decree, these measures bypassed the legislature. The confiscation of Atacama and Kennecott copper mines caused foreign investments to dry up. The Soviet Union came to Allende's assistance, extending to him over $500 million in loans. Other countries also offered aid, but it was not enough to rescue Chile's battered finances. To pay for the various social measures, including hikes in wages, the government resorted to printing presses, which produced an inflation that far surpassed anything seen under Frei. In the 3 years of Allende's presidency, the value of the currency in circulation increased by a factor of 15, and inflation exceeded 300% a year. Concurrently with the nationalization of enterprises, the government proceeded to collectivize agriculture. To this end, it tolerated, even encouraged, land seizures. The result was a dramatic drop in food production, with wheat crops declining by almost 50%. Acute shortages followed. When Allende's government fell, the country had flour reserves for only a few days. Protests mounted. The most serious of these were organized by truckers, small private entrepreneurs who objected to the government plans to compete with them by means of a national transport company. On 2 occasions, these strikes, which involved as many as 700,000 people, brought the country's transport and much of the economy to a standstill. In an orthodox communist country, such demonstrations would have been declared counter-revolutionary plots instigated by the CIA and suppressed. But in Allende's Chile, although the government controlled the radio and much of the press, there remained a considerable freedom of information which could not be silenced without provoking a national revolt. Opposition parties functioned and criticized the government, and above all, there was the Congress and the Supreme Court. In August 1973, the Chamber of Deputies voted 81 to 45 that Allende had violated the Constitution by usurping its legislative powers, ignoring the country's laws, and infringing on freedom of speech. The Supreme Court, for its part, condemned Allende for subordinating the judiciary to his political needs. In a view of absence, the Chilean constitution of provisions for impeachment, the chamber requested the armed forces to restore the laws of the land. Obeying this mandate, 18 days later, Chile's military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, forcibly removed Allende from office. The new regime was a dictatorship that dwelt quite brutally with the defeated socialists and communists. Cuba, the first and only enduring communist state in Latin America, presents an interesting case of a personal dictatorship by exceeding ambitious politician who found in communist ideology justification for his ambition. In the words of one scholar, historically, Castroism is a leader in such a movement in search of power, and a power search in ideology. Contrary to widespread opinion, pre-communist Cuba was never a backward or predominantly rural country. It had the second highest living standard in Latin America after Venezuela, which derived its wealth from petroleum. The majority of its inhabitants were literate and resided in the cities. Nor is it correct to say that this economy depended on sugar. Sugar was indeed the leading export commodity, but it accounted only for 1/3 or less of national income. In other words, the archetypal preconditions widely believed to account for communist revolutions, poverty, and backwardness were absent. When the communists took over Cuba, a wave of essentially middle-class rebellion against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, who in 1952 abolished a democratic constitution that he himself had promulgated during his earlier legislative years of office, 1933-44. Fidel Castro, son of a wealthy plantation owner and a student at the Havana Law School, rode to power on this wave of discontent. Although displaying left-wing sympathies, he was, to begin with, no communist. Indeed, he had no ideology at all, but only a craving for power. Marxism-Leninism was imbued to him by the Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara. Castro's program, designed to rally all the classes of the nation behind him, stressed above all the need to restore the 1940 Constitution. Very quickly, however, after assuming dictatorial authority in what he was genuine popular revolution, Castro veered leftward. He introduced a one-party government, carried out radical land reform, and in 1960, with Soviet encouragement, appropriated all U.S. holdings, in which led to President Eisenhower to retaliate with a trade embargo. The embargo, in turn, made Cuba increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union. Moscow, though initially cautious in supporting Castro for fear of U.S. reaction, nevertheless found itself gradually drawn into Cuban politics, especially after 1961, when Castro proclaimed Cuba a socialist country. The fiasco of the U.S. instigated Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 and the subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, which ended with Washington's pledge to respect Cuban sovereignty, placed the island firmly in the Soviet bloc. During this crisis, Castro had urged Moscow to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States, being prepared to sacrifice Cuba in order to assure the worldwide triumph of socialism. Moscow, which had restrained him, became now the primary economic supporter of Cuba, purchasing a large share of the Cuban sugar at artificially high prices, supplying her with oil and many industrial goods, and providing her with generous loans. According to Fidel Castro's brother, Raul, before its dissolution in the Soviet Union, had provided Cuba free of charge with $10 billion worth of military equipment. Cuba's economic dependence on Moscow was near total. In return, Castro loyally supported every Soviet foreign venture, from the invasion of Czechoslovakia to that of Afghanistan, provided Moscow with the intelligence listening post, and undertook to spread communism throughout Central and Latin America. At its founding Congress in Havana in mid-1967, the Castroite Latin America Organization of Solidarity, or OLAS, called for guerrilla warfare throughout Latin America. Internally, Castro introduced the standard Soviet-style regime. Within 10 years of his ascent to power, all sectors of the economy were nationalized except for agriculture, 30% of what was left in the hands of small and medium-sized farmers. The party monopolized politics. Workers forced to join state-controlled unions lost the right to organize their own, to bargain, or to strike. Considerable advances were made in social services, schooling, medicine, and housing, financed largely with the assets acquired from the pre-communist economy. Dissent was disposed of in two ways, but by allowing a large part of the middle class and lower middle class to emigrate, and by creating a Soviet-style revolutionary tribunals, and labor camps. While it was uncommon for communist leaders to be defied, most of them preferred to stay in the background as benefited deities. Not so Castro. He was everywhere, hungering his captive audiences for hours and on end with speeches in which he cajoled, inspired, and threatened. Much of his rhetoric was focused on the United States, which he demonized and blamed for whatever was wrong in Cuba. Living standards declined relentlessly, in part because of the resistance, mostly passive, of workers and farmers, in part because of the most enterprising, best-educated Cubans had emigrated to the United States. The survival of the communist regime came dependent on the Soviet support. Given this reality, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the refusal of the successor Yeltsin government to provide further aid to Cuba seemed to doom the Castro regime. Nevertheless, it managed to survive. It did so by making concessions to foreign capitalists who were allowed limited but not insufficient opportunities to invest in Cuba. Dollars began to circulate freely in the country. The regime made a major successful effort to promote tourism, extolling not only Cuba's beaches and tree resorts, but the beauty and availability of its young women. In 1992, in a speech to the National Assembly, Castro touted the advantages of Cuban prostitution by declaring his country to have the lowest incidence of AIDS. The campaign, which in 1999 brought in 1.7 million foreign tourists, made Cuba one of the most popular stops on a sex vacation circuit, right up there with Thailand.